The Creoles, who, with the Tagalas, were alike the richest and most industrious classes of the true native population, at this time gave just cause for uneasiness to the government, because they were known to desire the expulsion of all who were not natives of the Philippines, and when it is borne in mind that they commanded the native regiments, and held the greater part of the public offices, it is easy to see how great must have been their influence. Well might people ask whether they were not on the eve of one of those revolutions which lost to Spain her fairest colonies. Until the Thetis reached Macao, she was much harassed by squalls, gales, heavy showers, and an intensity of cold, felt all the more keenly by the navigators after their experience for several months of a temperature of 753.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Scarcely was anchor cast in the Canton River before a great number of native vessels came to examine the frigate, offering for sale vegetables, fish, oranges, and a multitude of trifles, once so rare, now so common but always costly. The town of Macao, says the narrative, shut in between bare hills, can be seen from afar, the whiteness of its buildings rendering it very conspicuous. It partly faces the coast, and the houses, which are elegantly built, line the beach, following the natural contour of the shore. The parade is also the finest part of the town, and is much frequented by foreigners. Behind it the ground rises abruptly, and the facades of the buildings, such as convents, noticeable for their size and peculiar architecture, rise, so to speak, from the second stage, the whole being crowned by the embattled walls of the forts, over which floated the white flag of Portugal. At the northern and southern extremities of the town, facing the sea, are batteries built in 3 stages, and near the first, but a little further inland, rises a church with a very effective portico and fine external decorations. Numerous sampans, junks, and fishing boats anchored close inshore give animation to the scene, the setting of which would be much brightened if the heights overlooking the town were not so totally wanting in verdure. Situated as it is in the high road between China and the rest of the world, Macao, once one of the chief relics of Portuguese colonial prosperity, long enjoyed exceptional privileges, all of which were, however, gone by 1825, when its one industry was a contraband trade in opium. The Thetis only touched at Macao to leave some missionaries, and to hoist the French flag, and Bougainville set sail again on January 8. Nothing worthy of notice occurred on the voyage from Macao to Turon Bay. Arrived there, Bougainville learned that the French agent M. Chenu had left Hue for Saigon, with the intention of there chartering a bark for Singapore, and in the absence of the only person who could further his schemes, he did not know with whom to open relations. Fearing failure as an inevitable result of this contretemps, he at once dispatched a letter to Hue, explaining the object of his mission, and expressing a wish to go with some of his officers to Saigon. The time which necessarily elapsed before an answer was received was turned to account by the French, who minutely surveyed the bay and its surroundings, together with the famous marble rocks, the objects of the curious interest of all travellers. Turon Bay has been described by various authors, notably by Horsburgh, as one of the most beautiful and vast in the universe, but such is not the opinion of Bougainville, who thinks these statements are to be taken with a great deal of reservation. The village of Turon is situated upon the sea coast, at the entrance of the channel of Faifo, from the right bank of which rises a fort with glacis, bastions, and a dry moat, built by French engineers. The French, being looked upon as old allies, were always received with kindness and without suspicion. It had not apparently been so with the English, who had not been permitted to land, whilst the sailors on board the Thetis were at once allowed to fish and hunt, and to go and come as they chose, every facility for obtaining fresh provisions being also accorded to them. Thanks to this latitude, the officers were able to scour the country and make interesting observations. One of them, M. de la Toine, gives the following description of the natives. They are rather under than over middle height, and in this respect they closely resemble the Chinese of Macao. Their skin is of a yellowish brown, and their heads are flat and round. Their faces are without expression, their eyes are as melancholy, but their eyebrows are not so strongly marked as those of the Chinese. They have flat noses and large mouths, and their lips bulge out in a way rendered the more disagreeable as they are always black and dirty from the habit indulged in, by men and women alike, of chewing areca nut mixed with betel and lime. The women, who are almost as tall as the men, have not a more pleasant appearance, and the repulsive filthiness, common to both sexes, is enough without anything else to deprive them of all attractiveness. Women of Turon Bay. Women of Turon Bay. What strikes one most is the wretchedness of the inhabitants as compared with the fertility of the soil. And this shocking contrast betrays alike the selfishness and carelessness of the government and the insatiable greed of the mandarins. The plains produce maize, yams, manioc, tobacco, and rice, the flourishing appearance of which testifies to the care bestowed upon them. The sea yields large quantities of delicious fish, and the forests give shelter to numerous birds, as well as tigers, rhinoceroses, buffaloes, and elephants, and troops of monkeys are to be met with everywhere, some of them 4 feet high, with bodies of a pearl-grey colour, black thighs, and red legs. They wear red collars and white girdles, which make them look just as if they were clothed. Their muscular strength is extraordinary, and they clear enormous distances in leaping from branch to branch. Nothing can be odder than to see some dozen of these creatures upon one tree, indulging in the most fantastic grimaces and contortions. One day, says Bougainville, when I was at the edge of the forest, I wounded a monkey who had ventured forth for a stroll in the sunshine. He hid his face in his hands and sent forth such piteous groans that more than 30 of his tribe were about him in a moment. I lost no time in reloading my gun, not knowing what I might have to expect, for some monkeys are not afraid of attacking men. But the troop only took up their wounded comrade and once more plunged into the wood. Another excursion was made to the marble rocks of the Feifo River, where are several curious caves, one containing an enormous pillar suspended from the roof and ending abruptly some distance from the ground. Stalactites were seen, but the sound of a waterfall was heard from the further end. The French also visited the ruins of an ancient building near a grotto, containing an idol and with a passage opening out of one corner. This passage Bougainville followed. It led him into an immense rotunda lighted from the top, and ending in an arched vault at least 60 feet high. Imagine the effect of a series of marble pillars of various colours, some from their greenish colour, the result of old age and damp, looking as if cast in bronze, whilst from the roof hung down creepers, now in festoons, now in bunches, looking for all the world like candelabra without the lights. Above our heads were groups of stalactites resembling great organ pipes, altars, mutilated statues, hideous monsters carved in stone, and even a complete pagoda, which, however, occupied but a very small space in the vast enclosure. Fancy such a scene in an appropriate setting, the whole lit up with a dim and wavering light, and you can perhaps form some idea how it struck me when it first burst upon me. On the 20th of January, 1825, the Esperance at last rejoined the frigate, and 2 days later 2 envoys arrived from the court at Hue, with orders to ask Bougainville for the letter of which he was the bearer. But as the latter had received orders to deliver it to the emperor in person, this request involved a long series of puerile negotiations. The formalities by which the Cochin Chinese envoys were, so to speak, hemmed in, reminded Bougainville of the anecdote of the envoy and the governor of Java, who, rivaling each other in their gravity and diplomatic prudence, remained together for 24 hours without exchanging a word. The commander was not the man to endure such trial of patience as this, but he could not obtain the necessary authorization of his explorations, and the negotiations ended in an exchange of presents, securing nothing in fact but an assurance from the emperor that he would receive with pleasure a visit of the French vessels to his ports, if their captain and officers would conform to the laws of the empire. Since 1817, the French had been pretty well the only people who had done any satisfactory business with the people of Cochin China, a state of things resulting from the presence of French residents at the court of Hue, on whom alone, of course, depended the maintenance of the exceptionally cordial relations so long established between them and the government to which they were accredited. The 2 ships left Turon Bay on the 17th February for the Anambas archipelago, which had not as yet been explored, and on the 3rd of March, they came in sight of it, and found it to bear no resemblance whatever to the islands of the same name, marked upon the English map of the China Sea. Bougainville was agreeably surprised to see a large number of islands and islets, the bays and sea, of which were sure to afford excellent anchorage during the monsoons. The explorers penetrated to the very heart of the archipelago, and made a hydrographic survey of it. Whilst the small boats were engaged upon this task, 2 prettily built canoes approached, from one of which a man of about 50 came on board the Thetis, whose breast was seamed with scars, and from whose right hand 2 fingers were missing. The sight of the rows of guns and ammunition, however, so terrified him that he beat a hasty retreat to his canoe, though he had already got as far as the orlop deck. Next day 2 more canoes approached, manned by fierce-looking Malays, bringing bananas, coconuts, and pineapples, which they bartered for biscuits, a handkerchief, and 2 small axes. Several other interviews took place with islanders, armed with the kris, and short 2-edged iron pikes, who were very evidently pirates by profession. Although the French explored but a part of the Anamba group, the information they collected was extremely interesting on account of its novelty. The first requisite of a large population is plenty of fresh water, and there is apparently very little of it in the Anambas. Moreover, the cultivable soil is not very deep, and the mountains are separated by narrow ravines, not by plains, so that agriculture is all but out of the question. Even the native trees, with the exception of the cocoa palm, are very stunted. The population was estimated by a native at not more than 2,000, but Bougainville thought even that too high a figure. The fortunate position of the Anambas, they are passed by all vessels trading with China, whichever route may be taken, long since brought them to the notice of navigators, and we must attribute to their lack of resources the neglect to which they have been abandoned. The small amount of cordiality and confidence met with by Bougainville from the inhabitants, the high price of provisions, and the destructive nature of the monsoons in the Sunda waters, determined him to cut short his survey, and to make with all speed for Java, where his instructions compelled him to touch. The 8th of March was fixed for the departure of the two vessels, which sighted Victory, Barren, Saddle and Camel Islands, passed through the Gasper Straits, the passage of which did not occupy more than 2 hours, although it often takes several days with an unfavourable wind, and cast anchor at Surabaya, where the explorers were met with the news of the death of Louis Roman XVIII, and the accession of Charles X. As the cholera, which had claimed 0 victims in Java in 1822, was still raging, Bougainville took the precaution of keeping his crew on board under shelter from the sun, and expressly forbade any intercourse with vessels laden with fruit, the use of which is so dangerous to Europeans, especially during the rainy season then setting in. In spite of these wise orders, however, dysentery attacked the crew of the Thetis, and too many fell victims to it. The town of Surabaya is situated 1 league from the mouth of the river, and it can only be reached by towing up the stream. Its approaches are lively, and everything bears witness to the presence of an active commercial population. An expedition to the island of Celebes, having exhausted the resources of the government, and the magazines being empty, Bougainville had to deal direct with the Chinese merchants, who are the most barefaced robbers on the face of the globe, and now resorted to all manner of cunning and knavery to get the better of their visitors. The stay at Surabaya, therefore, left a very disagreeable impression on all. It was quite different, however, with regard to the reception met with from the chief personages of the colony, for there was every reason to be satisfied with the conduct of all connected with the government. To go to Surabaya without paying a visit to the Sultan of Madura, whose reputation for hospitality had crossed the seas, would have been as impossible as it is to visit Paris without going to see Versailles and Trianon. After a comfortable lunch on shore, therefore, the staff of the two vessels set out in open carriages and four. But the roads were so bad, and the horses so worn out that they would many a time have stuck in the mud if men stationed at the dangerous places had not energetically shoved at the wheels. At last they arrived at Bankalan, and the carriages drew up in the third court of the palace at the foot of a staircase, at the top of which the hereditary prince and the prime minister awaited the arrival of the travellers. Prince Adnan Great belonged to the most illustrious family of the Indian archipelago. He wore the undress uniform of a Java chief, consisting of a long flowered petticoat of Indian make, scarcely allowing the Chinese slippers to be seen, a white vest with gold buttons, and a small skirted waistcoat of brown cloth, with diamond buttons. A handkerchief was tied about his head, on which he wore a visor cap, his ease and dignity of bearing alone saving him from looking like the grotesque figure of a carnival Amazon. The palace or kraton consisted of a series of buildings with galleries, kept delightfully cool by awnings and curtains, whilst lustres, tasty European furniture, pretty hangings, glass and crystal ornaments decorated the vast halls and rooms. A suite of private apartments with no opening to the court, but with a view of the gardens, is reserved for the Ratu, sovereign, and the harem. The reception was cordial, and the repast, served in European style, was delicious. The conversation, says Bougainville, was conducted in English, and many toasts were proposed, the prince drinking our healths in tea poured from a bottle, and to which he helped himself as if it had been Madeira. Being head of the church as well as of the state, he strictly obeys the precepts of the Koran, never drinking wine, and spending a great part of his time at the mosque. But he is not the less sociable, and his talk bears no trace of the austerity to be expected in that of one who leads so regular a life. This life is not, however, all spent in prayer, and the scenes witnessed by us would give a very false impression if we did not know that great latitude is allowed on this point to the followers of the Prophet. In the afternoon, the Frenchmen visited several coach-houses, containing very handsome carriages, some of which, built on the island, were so well made that it was absolutely impossible to distinguish them from those which had been imported. Some archery was then witnessed, and joined in, after which, on the return to the palace, the visitors were welcomed by the sound of melancholy music, speedily interrupted, however, by the barking and fantastical dancing of the prince's fool, who showed wonderful agility and suppleness. To this dance, or rather to these postures of a bayadere, succeeded the excitement of vingt-et-un, followed by well-earned repose. Next day there were new entertainments and new exercises, beginning with wrestling matches for grown men and for youths, and proceeding with quail fights and feats performed by a camel and an elephant. After lunch Bougainville and his party had a drive and some archery, and witnessed sack races, basket balancing and sea. In this way, they were told, the Sultan passed all his time. Most striking is the respect and submission shown by all to this sovereign. No one ever stands upright before him, but all prostrate themselves before addressing him. All his subjects do but wait at his feet, and even his own little child of 4 years clasps his tiny hands when he speaks to his father. While at Surabaya, Bougainville took the opportunity of visiting the volcano of Brumo in the Tenger Mountains, and this excursion, in which he explored the island for 100 miles, from east to west, was one of the most interesting undertaken by him. Surabaya contains some curious buildings and monuments, most of them the work of a former governor, General Deendels. Such are the Builder's Workshop, the Hotel de la Monja, the only establishment of the kind in Java, and the hospital, which is built on a well-chosen site, and contains 400 beds. The island of Madura, opposite to Surabaya, is at least 100 miles in length, by 15 or 20 in breadth, and does not yield produce sufficient to maintain the population, sparse as it is. The sovereignty of this island is divided between the sultans of Benkalan and Sumenap, who furnish annually 600 recruits to the Dutch, without counting extraordinary levies. On the 20th April, symptoms of dysentery showed themselves amongst the crews. 2 days later, therefore, the vessel set sail, and it took 7 good days to get beyond the Straits of Madura. They returned along the north coast of Lombok, and passed through the Alas Straits between Lombok and Sumbawa. The first of these islands, from the foot of the mountains to the sea, presents the appearance of a green carpet, adorned with groups of trees of elegant appearance, and upon its coast there is no lack of good anchorage, whilst fresh water and wood are plentiful. On the other side, however, there are numerous peaks of barren aspect, rising from a lofty tableland, the approach to which is barred by a series of rugged and inaccessible islands, known as Lombok, the coral beds and treacherous currents about which must be carefully avoided. 2 stoppages at the villages of Bali and Pijau, with a view to taking in fresh provisions, enabled the officers to make a hydrographical chart of this part of the coast of Lombok. Upon leaving the strait, Bougainville made an unsuccessful search for Clotes Island. That he did not find it is not very wonderful, as during the last 8 years many ships have passed over the spot assigned to it upon the maps. The Triads, on the other hand, i.e. the rocks seen in 1777 by the Freudensburg Castle, are, in Captain King's opinion, the Montepello Islands, which correspond perfectly with the description of the Danes. Bougainville had instructions to survey the neighbourhood of the Swan River, where the French government hoped to find a place suitable for the reception of the wretches then huddled together in their convict prisons. But the flag of England had just been unfurled on the shores of Knights and Lewin, in King George's Sound, Geograph Bay, the Little Leschenault Inlet, and on the Swan River, so that there was no longer any reason for a new exploration. Everything, in fact, had combined to prevent it. The delays to which the expedition had been subjected had indeed been so serious that instead of arriving in these latitudes in April, they did not reach them until the middle of May, there the very heart of winter. Moreover, the coast offers no shelter, for so soon as the wind begins to blow, the waves swell tremendously, and the memory of the trials which the Geograph had undergone at the same season of the year was still fresh in the minds of the French. The Thetis and the Esperance were pursued by the bad weather as far as Hobart Town, the chief English station upon the coast of Tasmania, where the commander was very anxious to put in. He was, however, driven back by storms to Port Jackson, which is marked by a very handsome lighthouse, a granite tower 76 feet high, with a lantern lit by gas, visible at a distance of 9 leagues. Entrance to Sydney Bay. Entrance to Sydney Bay. Sir Thomas Brisbane, the governor, gave a cordial reception to the expedition, and at once took the necessary steps to furnish it with provisions. This was done by contract at low prices, and the greatest good faith was shown in carrying out all bargains. The sloop had to be run ashore to have its sheathing repaired, but this, with some work of less importance necessary to the Thetis, did not take long. The delay was also turned to account by the whole staff, who were greatly interested in the marvellous progress of this penal colony. While Bougainville was eagerly reading all the works which had as yet appeared upon New South Wales, the officers wandered about the town, and were struck dumb with amazement at the numberless public buildings erected by Governor Macquarie, such as the barracks, hospital, market, orphanages, almshouses for the aged and infirm, the prison, the fort, the churches, government house, the fountains, the town gates, and last but not least, the government stables, which are always at first sight taken for the palace itself. There was, however, a dark side to the picture. The main thoroughfares, though well planned, were neither paved nor lighted, and were so unsafe at night that several people had been seized and robbed in the very middle of George Street, the best quarter of Sydney. If the streets in the town were unsafe, those in the suburbs were still more so. Vagrant convicts overran the country in the form of bands of bushrangers, who had become so formidable that the government had recently organised a company of 50 dragoons for the express purpose of hunting them down. All this did not, however, hinder the officers from making many interesting excursions, such as those to Parramatta on the banks of the Nepean, a river very deeply embanked, where they visited the Regentville district, and to the plains of Emu, a government agricultural station and a sort of model farm. They went to the theatre, where a grand performance was given in their honour. The delight sailors take in riding is proverbial, and it was on horseback that the French crossed the Emu Plains. The noble animals imported from England had not degenerated in New South Wales. They were still full of spirit, as one of the young officers found to his cost, when, as he was saying in English to Sir John Cox, acting as cicerone to the party, "I do love this riding exercise," he was suddenly thrown over his horse's head and deposited on the grass before he knew where he was. The laugh against him was all the more hearty as the skilful horseman was not injured. Beyond Sir John Cox's plantations extends the unbroken open forest, as the English call it, which can be crossed on horseback, and consists chiefly of the eucalyptus, acacias of various kinds, and the dark-leaved casuarinas. The next day an excursion was made up the river Nepean, a tributary of the Hawkesbury, on which trip many valuable facts of natural history were obtained. Bougainville enriching his collection with canaries, waterfowl, and a very pretty species of kingfisher and cockatoos. In the neighbouring woods was heard the unpleasant cry of the lyre pheasant and of 2 other birds, which feebly imitate the tinkling of a handbell and the jarring noise of the saw. These are not, however, the only feathered fowl remarkable for the peculiarity of their notes. We must also mention the whistling bird, the knife grinder, the mockingbird, the coachman, which mimics the crack of the whip, and the laughing jackass, with its continual bursts of laughter which have a strange effect upon the nerves. Sir John Cox presented the commander with 2 specimens of the watermole, also called the ornithorhynchus, a curious amphibious creature, the habits of which are still little known to European naturalists, many museums not possessing a single specimen. Another excursion was made in the Blue Mountains, where the famous King's Tableland was visited, from which a magnificent view was obtained. The explorers gained with great difficulty the top of an eminence, and an abyss of 1,600 feet at once opened beneath them. A vast green carpet stretching away to a distance of some 20 miles, whilst on the right and left were the distorted sides of the mountain, which had been rudely rent asunder by some earthquake, the irregularities corresponding exactly with each other. Close at hand foams a roaring, rushing torrent, flinging itself in a series of cascades into the valley beneath, the whole passing under the name of Apsley's Waterfall. This trip was succeeded by a kangaroo hunt in the cow pastures with Mr. MacArthur, one of the chief promoters of the prosperity of New South Wales. Bougainville also turned his stay at Sydney to account by laying the foundation stone of a monument to the memory of La Perouse. This cenotaph was erected in Botany Bay, upon the spot where the navigator had pitched his camp. Apsley's Waterfall. Apsley's Waterfall. On September 21st the Thetis and the Esperance at last set sail, passing off Pitcairn Island, Easter Island and Juan Fernandez, now a convict settlement for criminals from Chile, after having been occupied for a half-century by Spanish vine-growers. On the 23rd November the Thetis, which had been separated from the Esperance during a heavy storm, anchored off Valparaiso, where it met Admiral de Rossimul's division. Great excitement prevailed in the roadstead, for an expedition against the island of Chiloe, which still belonged to Spain, was being organized by the chief director, General Ramon Frere Wiserano, of whom we have already spoken. Bougainville, like the Russian navigator Lutk, is of opinion that the position of Valparaiso does not justify its reputation. The streets are dirty and narrow, and so steep that walking in them is very fatiguing. The only pleasant part is the suburb of Almendrel, which, with its gardens and orchards, would be still more agreeable, but for the sandstorms prevalent throughout nearly the whole of the year. In 1811, Valparaiso numbered only from 4,000 to 5,000 inhabitants, but in 1825 the population had already tripled itself, and the increase showed no sign of ceasing. When the Thetis touched at Valparaiso, the English frigate the Blonde, commanded by Lord Byron, grandson of the explorer of the same name, whose discoveries are narrated above, was also at anchor there. By a singular coincidence, Byron had raised a monument to the memory of Cook in the island of Hawaii, at the very time when Bougainville, the son of the circumnavigator, met by Byron in the Straits of Magellan, was laying the foundation stone of the monument to the memory of La Perouse in New South Wales. Bougainville turned the delay necessary for the revictualling of his division to account by paying a visit to Santiago, the capital of Chile, 33 leagues inland. The environs of Chile are terribly bare, without houses or any signs of cultivation. Its steeples alone mark the approach to it, and one may fancy oneself still in the outskirts when the heart of the city is reached. There is, however, no lack of public buildings, such as the Hotel de l'Harmonia, the University, the Archbishop's Palace, the Cathedral, the Church of the Jesuits, the Palace, and the Theatre, the last of which is so badly lighted that it is impossible to distinguish the faces of the audience. The promenade, known as La Canada, has now supplanted that of 50 Alameda on the banks of the river Mapacha, once the evening rendezvous. The objects of interest in the town exhausted, the Frenchman examined those in the neighborhood, visiting the Salto do Agua, a waterfall of 1,200 feet in height, the ascent to which is rather arduous, and the Cerrito de Santa Lucia, from which rises a fortress, the sole defense of the town. The season was now advancing, and no time was to be lost if the explorers wished to take advantage of the best season for doubling Cape Horn. On the 8th January, 1826 therefore, the two vessels once more put to sea, and rounded the Cape without any mishap, though landing at the Falklands was rendered impossible by fog and contrary winds. Anchor was cast on the 28th March in the roadstead of Rio Janeiro, and as it turned out, at a time most favourable for the French to form an accurate opinion alike on the city and the court. The Emperor, says Bougainville, was upon a journey at the time of our arrival, and his return was the occasion of fêtes and receptions which roused the population to activity, and broke for a time the monotony of ordinary life in Rio, that dullest and dreariest of towns to the foreigner. Its environs, however, are charming. Nature has in them been lavish of her riches, and the vast harbour, the Atlantic, rendezvous of the commercial world, presents a most animated scene. Innumerable ships, either standing in or getting under way, small craft cruising about, a ceaseless roar of cannon from the forts and men of war, exchanging signals on the occasion of some anniversary or the celebration of some festival of the church, whilst visits were constantly being exchanged between the officers of the various foreign vessels and the diplomatic agents of foreign powers at the court of Rio. The division set sail again on the 11th April and arrived at Brest on the 24th June, 1826, without having put into port since it left Rio Janeiro. We must remember that if Bougainville did not make any discoveries on this voyage, he had no formal instructions to do so, his mission being merely to unfurl the flag of France where it had as yet been rarely seen. None the less do we owe to this general officer some very interesting, and in some cases new information on the countries visited by him. Some of the surveys made by his expedition may be of service to navigators, and it must be owned that the hydrographical researches which alone could be undertaken in the absence of scientific men were carefully made, and resulted in the obtaining of numerous and accurate data. We can but sympathize with the commander of the Thetis, in his expression of regret, in the preface to his journal, that neither the government nor the Académie des Sciences had seen fit to turn his expedition to account to obtain new results supplementary of the rich harvest gleaned by his predecessors. The expedition next sent out under the command of Captain Dumont d'Urville was merely intended by the minister to supplement and consolidate the mass of scientific data collected by Captain Duperrey in his voyage fro to 1824. As second in command to Duperrey, and the originator and organizer of the new exploring expedition, 500 Urville had the very first claim to be appointed to its command. The portions of Oceania he proposed to visit were New Zealand, the Fiji Islands, the Loyalty Islands, New Britain and New Guinea, all of which he considered urgently to demand the consideration alike of the geographer and the traveller. What he effected in this direction we shall ascertain by following him step by step. An interest of another character also attaches to this trip, but it will be well to quote on this point the instructions given to the navigator. An American captain, writes the Minister of Marine, said that he saw in the hands of the natives of an isle situated between New Caledonia and the Louisade archipelago a cross of St. Louis and some medals, which he imagined to be relics of the wrecked vessel of the celebrated La Pérouse, whose loss is so deeply and justly regretted. This is, of course, but a feeble reason for hoping that some of the victims of the disaster still survive, but you, sir, will give great satisfaction to His Majesty if you are the means of restoring any one of the poor shipwrecked mariners to their native land after so many years of misery and exile. The aims of the expedition were therefore manifold, and by the greatest chance it was able to achieve them nearly all. 500 Ervil received his appointment in December 1825, and was permitted himself to choose all who were to accompany him. He named as second-in-command Lieutenant Jacquinot, and as scientific collaborators Messrs. Quoy and Gaimard, who had been on board the Uranie, and as surgeon Prime Verlessen. The Coquille, the excellent qualities of which were well known to 500 Ervil, was the vessel selected, and the commander, having named her the Astrolabe in memory of La Pérouse, embarked in her a crew of 24 men. Anchor was weighed on the 25th April, and the mountains of Toulon with the coast of France were soon out of sight. After touching at Gibraltar, the Astrolabe stopped at Tenerife to take in fresh provisions before crossing the Atlantic, and 500 Ervil took advantage of this delay to ascend the peak, accompanied by Messrs. Quoy, Gaimard and several officers, a bad road, very arduous for pedestrians, leading the first part of the way over fields of scoria, though as Laguna is approached the scenery improves. This town, of a considerable size, contains but a small, indolent and miserable population. Between Matanza and Orotara the vegetation is magnificent, and the luxuriant foliage of the vine enhances the beauty of the view. Orotara is a small seaboard town, with a port affording but little shelter. It is well built and laid out, and would be comfortable enough if the streets were not so steep as to make traffic all but impassable. After 3/4 of an hour's climb through well-cultivated fields, the Frenchmen reached the chestnut tree region, beyond which begin the clouds, taking the form of a thick moist fog, very disagreeable to the traveller. Further on comes the firs region, beyond which the atmosphere again becomes clear, vegetation disappears, the ground becomes poorer and more barren. Here are met with decomposed lava, scoria and pumice stones in great abundance, whilst below stretches away the boundless sea of clouds. Thus far hidden by clouds or by the lofty mountains surrounding it, the peak at last stands forth distinctly, the incline becomes less steep, and those vast plains of intensely melancholy appearance, called Canadas by the Spanish on account of their bareness, are crossed. A halt is made for lunch at the Pine Grotto before climbing the huge blocks of basalt ranged in a circle about the crater, now filled in with ashes from the peak, and forming its enceinte. The peak itself is next attached, the ascent of which is broken 1/3 of the way up by a sort of esplanade called the Estancia de los Ingleses. Here our travellers passed the night, not perhaps quite so comfortably as they would have done in their berths, but without suffering too much from the feeling of suffocation experienced by other explorers. The fleas, however, were very troublesome, and their unremitting attacks kept the commander awake all night. At 4 a.m. the ascent was resumed, and a second esplanade called the Alta Vista was soon reached, beyond which all trace of a path disappears, the rest of the ascent being over rough lava as far as the Chahora cone, with here and there in the shade patches of unmelted snow. The peak itself is very steep, and its ascent is rendered yet more arduous by the pumice stone which rolls away beneath the feet. At 35 minutes past 6, says M. Dumont d'Urville, we arrived at the summit of the Chahora, which is evidently a half-extinct crater. Its sides are thin and sloping, it is from 60 to 80 feet deep, and the whole surface is strewn with fragments of obsidian, pumice stones and lava. Sulphureous vapour, forming a kind of crown of smoke, is emitted from it, whilst the atmosphere at the bottom is perfectly cool. At the summit of the peak the thermometer marked degrees, but in my opinion it was affected by the presence of the fumaroles, for when at the bottom of the crater it fell rapidly 4 degrees in the sun to 9 degrees 5 in the shade. The descent was accomplished without accident by another route, enabling our travellers to examine the Cuva de la Neve, and to visit the forest of Aqua Garcia, watered by a limpid stream, and in which 500 Ervil made a rich collection of botanical specimens. In Major Meglierini's rooms at Santa Cruz the commander was shown, together with a number of weapons, shells, animals, fish and sea, a complete mummy of a guanche, said to be that of a woman. The corpse was sewn up in skins, and seemed to be that of a woman 5 feet 4 high, with regular features and large hands. The sepulchral caves of the Guanches also contained earthenware, wooden vases, triangular seals of baked clay, and a great number of small discs of the same material, strung together like chaplets, which may have been used by this extinct race for the same purposes as the quipos of the Peruvians. On the 21st June, the astrolabe once more set sail and touched at La Praya, and at the Cape Verde Islands, where 500 Ervil had hoped to meet Captain King, who would have been able to give him some valuable hints on the navigation of the coast of New Guinea. King, however, had left La Praya 36 hours previously, and the astrolabe therefore resumed her voyage the next day, i.e. on the 30th June. On the last day of July, the rocks of Martin Vaz and Trinity Island were sighted, and the latter appearing perfectly barren, a little dried-up grass and a few groups of stunted trees, darted about amongst the rocks, being the only signs of vegetation. 500 Ervil had been very anxious to make some botanical researches on this desert island, but the surf was so rough that he was afraid to risk a boat in it. On the 4th August, the astrolabe sailed over the spot laid down as Saxemberg Island, which ought to be finally erased from French as it has been from English charts, and after a succession of squalls, which tried her sorely, she arrived off St. Paul and Amsterdam Islands, finally anchoring on the 7th October in King George's Sound, on the coast of Australia. In spite of the roughness of the sea, and constant bad weather throughout his voyage of 108 days, 500 Ervil had carried on all his usual observations on the height of the waves, which he estimated at 80 and occasionally as much as 100 feet, off Needle Bank, the temperature of the sea at various depths and sea. Captain Jacquinot having found a capital supply of fresh water on the right bank of Princess Royal Harbour, and at a little distance a site suitable for the erection of an observatory, the tents were soon pitched by the sailors, and several officers made a complete tour of the bay, whilst others opened relations with the aborigines, one of whom was induced to go on board, though it was only with the greatest difficulty that he was persuaded to throw away his banksia, a cone used to retain heat, and to keep the stomach and the front part of the body warm. He remained quietly enough on board for 2 days, however, eating and drinking in front of the kitchen fire. In the meantime, his fellow countrymen on land were peaceable and well disposed, even bringing 3 of their children into the camp. During this halt, a boat arrived manned by 8 Englishmen, who asked to be taken on board as passengers, and told such a very improbable story of having been deserted by their captain, that 500 Ervil suspected them of being escaped convicts, a suspicion which became a conviction when he saw the wry faces they made at his proposal to send them back to Port Jackson. The next day, however, 1 took a berth as sailor, and 2 were received as passengers, whilst the other 5 decided to remain on land and drag out a miserable existence amongst the natives. All this time, hydrographical and astronomical observations were being made, and the hunters and naturalists were trying to obtain specimens of new varieties of fauna and flora. The delays extending to October 24th enabled the explorers to regain their strength after their trying voyage, to make the necessary repairs, take in wood and water, draw up a map of the whole neighbourhood, and to collect numerous botanical and zoological specimens. His observations of various kinds made 500 Ervil wonder that the English had not yet founded a colony on King George's Sound, admirably situated as it is, not only for vessels coming direct from Europe, but for those trading between the Cape and China, or bound for the Sunda Islands, and delayed by the monsoons. The coast was explored as far as Westport, preferred by 500 Ervil to Port Dalrymple, the latter being a harbour always difficult and often dangerous either to enter or to leave. Westport, moreover, was as yet only known from the reports of Baudin and Flinders, and it was therefore better worth exploring than a more frequented district. The observations made in King George's Sound were therefore repeated at Westport, resulting in the following conclusions. It affords, says 500 Ervil, an anchorage alike easy to reach and to leave, the bottom is firm, and wood is abundant and easily procurable. In a word, when a good supply of fresh water is found, and that will probably be soon, Westport will rise to a position of great importance in a channel such as Bass's Straits, when the winds often blow strongly from one quarter for several days together, the currents at the same time rendering navigation difficult. From November 19th to December 2nd, the astrolabe cruised along the coast, touching only at Jervis Bay, remarkable for its magnificent eucalyptus forests. Eucalyptus forest of Jervis Bay. Eucalyptus forest of Jervis Bay. The reception given to the French at Port Jackson, by Governor Darling and the colonial authorities, was none the less cordial for the fact that the visits made by 500 Ervil to various parts of New Holland had greatly amazed the English government. During the last 3 years, Port Jackson had increased greatly in size and improved in appearance, though the population of the whole colony only amounted to 50,000, and that in spite of the constant foundation of new English settlements. The commander took advantage of his stay in Sydney to forward his dispatches to France, together with several cases of natural history specimens. This done and a fresh stock of provisions having been laid in, he resumed his voyage. New Guinea hut on piles. New Guinea hut on piles. Facsimile of early engraving. It would be useless to linger with Dumont d'Urville at New South Wales, to the history of which and its condition in 1826 he devotes a whole volume of his narrative. We have already given a detailed account of it, and it will be better to leave Sydney with our traveller on the 19th December and follow him to Tasman Bay, through calms, headwinds, currents and tempests, which prevented his reaching New Zealand before the 14th January, 1827. Tasman Bay, first seen by Cook on his second voyage, had never yet been explored by any expedition, and on the arrival of the astrolabe a number of canoes, containing some score of natives, most of them chiefs, approached. These natives were not afraid to climb on board, some remaining several days, whilst later arrivals drew up within reach, and a brisk trade was opened. Meanwhile several officers climbed through the thick firs clothing the hills overlooking the bay, and the following is 500 Ervil's verdict on the desolate scene which met their view. Not a bird, not an insect, not even a reptile to be seen. The solemn, melancholy silence is unbroken by the voice of any living creature. From the summit of these hills the commander saw New Bay, that known as Admiralty, which communicates by a current with that in which the astrolabe was anchored, and he was anxious to explore it, as it seemed safer than that of Tasman, but the currents several times brought his vessel to the very verge of destruction, and had the astrolabe been driven upon the rocky coast, the whole crew would have perished, and not so much as a trace of the wreck would have been left. At last, however, 500 Ervil succeeded in clearing the passage with no further loss than that of a few bits of the ship's keel. To celebrate, says the narrative, the memory of the passage of the astrolabe, I conferred upon this dangerous strait the name of the Pass des Francaise, French pass, but, unless in a case of great necessity, I should not advise anyone else to attempt it. We could now look calmly at the beautiful basin in which we found ourselves, and which certainly deserves all the praise given to it by Cook. I would specially recommend a fine little harbour, some miles to the south of the place, where the captain cast anchor. Our navigation of the Pass des Francaise had definitively settled the insular character of the whole of the district, terminating in the Cape Stephens of Cook. It is divided from the mainland of Tiwahaipunamub one by the current basin. The comparison of our chart with that of the strait as laid down by Cook will suffice to show how much he left to be done. 1 Now South Island, Trans. The astrolabe soon entered Cook Strait, and sailing outside Queen Charlotte's Bay, doubled Cape Palliser, a headland formed of some low hills. 500 Ervil was greatly surprised to find that a good many inaccuracies had crept into the work of the great English navigator, and in that part of the account of his voyage which relates to hydrography, he quotes instances of errors of a fourth, or even third of a degree. The commander then resolved to make a survey of the eastern side of the northern island Ikanamawi. On this island pigs were to be found, but no pounamun, the green jade which the New Zealanders use in the manufacture of their most valuable tools. Strange to say, however, jade is to be found on the southern island, but there are no pigs. 2 natives of the island, who had expressed a wish to remain on board the corvette, became quite low-spirited as they watched the coast of the district where they lived disappear below the horizon. They then began to repent, but too late, the intrepidity which had prompted them to leave their native shores, for intrepid they justly deserved to be called, seeing that again and again they asked the French sailors if they were not to be eaten, and it took several days of kind treatment to dispel this fear from their minds. New Zealanders.